The frigid night air swept across Catherine Tucker's face as she stumbled through the knee-deep snow, her tears freezing upon her cheeks before they could fall. Behind her, the cabin she had called home for 3 months grew smaller, its windows dark and unforgiving in the moonlight. Her husband of 6 months, Edmund, had packed his belongings and ridden off toward the gold fields near Pike's Peak, leaving nothing but a hastily scrawled note and the dying embers in the fireplace. February 1860, in Victor, Colorado, was no time for a woman to be alone, especially not one with nowhere to go and no family for 1,000 miles. Catherine clutched her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, her fingers numb and her breath coming out in visible puffs that dissipated into the darkness. The town of Victor lay 3 miles ahead, but in this blizzard, it might as well have been 30. She had no choice but to press forward, each step a battle against the wind that howled like a hungry wolf at her heels. "You fool," she whispered to herself. "You foolish, trusting woman." She had followed Edmund west from Philadelphia, with stars in her eyes and promises of prosperity in her heart. The daughter of a banker, she had shocked her family by marrying a man with dreams bigger than his pockets, a charming fellow who spoke of mountains filled with gold and valleys where they would build a dynasty. Now, at 22, she found herself abandoned in a wilderness that cared nothing for broken vows or shattered dreams. As the wind intensified, Catherine's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed into the snow. The cold began to seep through her dress, a deadly embrace that promised relief from her pain if only she would surrender to sleep. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she thought of her father's warnings about Edmund's wandering eyes and restless spirit. She should have listened. "Get up," a deep voice commanded, cutting through the howling wind. Catherine's eyes fluttered open to see a large figure on horseback looming above her, silhouetted against the night sky. For a moment, she thought death had come for her in the form of some spectral rider. "I said get up, madam. You'll freeze to death out here." The man dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jangling as his boots hit the snow. "Let me," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "He left me in the cold. Let me be." The stranger knelt beside her, and she could make out his features now, a strong jaw covered in dark stubble, piercing eyes beneath the brim of a worn cowboy hat, and shoulders broad enough to block the wind that had been tormenting her. "He left you in the cold," the cowboy repeated, his voice softening slightly as he reached down and lifted her effortlessly into his arms. "Then you'll never freeze again, not while I draw breath." With gentle strength, he placed her atop his horse before mounting behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, his body warm against her back. Catherine wanted to protest, to tell this stranger she needed no man's help, but the words died in her throat as warmth began to return to her limbs, painful and sharp. "Name's Henry Garrett," he said against her ear as the horse began to move forward, "and I reckon you've got quite a story to tell." Catherine leaned back against him, too weak to do anything else. "Catherine Tucker," she managed through chattering teeth. "And yes, Mr. Garrett, I suppose I do." The horse trudged through the snow, carrying them toward the distant lights of Victor, where Catherine's new life awaited, though she didn't know it yet. Henry's cabin stood on the outskirts of Victor, a sturdy structure that had weathered 5 harsh winters. Inside, a fire roared in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the simple but clean interior. Catherine sat wrapped in a thick blanket, her hands clutching a cup of hot coffee laced with whiskey. The warmth spread through her body, thawing her frozen fingers and toes with painful intensity. "Your husband," Henry said, not a question but a statement as he stoked the fire. "He went after gold," Catherine nodded, taking a sip of the burning liquid. Edmund always dreamed bigger than reality allowed. We married last summer in Philadelphia. He convinced me to come west with tales of fortune and adventure." She laughed bitterly. 6 months of hardship, and he decides I'm not worth the trouble. Left a note saying he needed to make his fortune without unnecessary burdens. I was the burden, Mr. Garrett. Henry's face hardened. Some men don't deserve the name. He hung the poker back on its hook. I've seen it before. Gold fever makes men mad, turns them into something less than human. "And what about you?" Catherine asked, studying him carefully. He appeared to be in his early 30s with lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. "Are you not chasing the same dream?" Henry shook his head. "I came for gold, yes. Found enough to buy land, start a small herd. Now I raise cattle and horses, supply the mining camps with meat, more reliable than chasing color in the streams." He paused. More honest, too. A silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. Catherine finished her coffee, feeling its warming effects throughout her body. "You should rest," Henry said, gesturing to a curtained-off area. "Take my bed, I'll sleep by the fire." Catherine stood, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. "I've imposed enough. I should find the boarding house in town in this storm." "No, madam." Henry's tone left no room for argument. "Tomorrow we can figure out your next steps. Tonight you need warmth and rest." Too exhausted to protest further, Catherine nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Henry's expression softened. "I know what would have happened, and I couldn't let that be. Not to anyone, and certainly not to a lady like yourself." Behind the curtain, Catherine found a simple but clean bed. She removed her snow-dampened dress and hung it on a hook, slipping beneath the covers in her chemise and petticoat. The sheets smelled of soap and pine, and despite the strangeness of her situation, she felt safer than she had in months. As sleep began to claim her, Catherine heard Henry moving about the cabin, the soft sounds of a man settling in for the night. She wondered what twist of fate had placed him on that snowy road at exactly the right moment, and what tomorrow would bring in this harsh but beautiful territory that had already taken so much from her. The morning light filtered through the cabin's small windows, casting a golden glow across the worn wooden floor. Catherine awoke disoriented, momentarily forgetting the events of the previous night. The smell of coffee and frying bacon brought her fully awake, and she remembered Edmund's abandonment, the freezing night, and Henry Garrett's unexpected rescue. She dressed quickly in her now dry clothes, smoothing her auburn hair as best she could without a proper brush. When she emerged from behind the curtain, Henry stood at the stove, his back to her. He'd already been outside, his coat hung by the door, dusted with melting snow. "Morning," he said without turning. "Thought you might be hungry." "Starving," Catherine admitted, taking a seat at the small table. "I didn't realize until now." Henry placed a plate before her, bacon, fried potatoes, and sourdough bread before serving himself and sitting across from her. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the clink of forks against plates and the occasional pop from the fireplace. "Storm's past," Henry finally said. "Road to town should be passable by midday." Catherine nodded, setting down her fork. "Mr. Garrett, I can't thank you enough for your kindness. Once I get to town, I'll find work and repay you." Henry waved away her words. "No debt between us, Mrs. Tucker." "Anyone would have done the same." "I'm not so sure of that," Catherine replied softly. "And please call me Catherine." A hint of a smile tugged at Henry's lips. "Catherine, then, and I'm Henry, not Mr. Garrett." "Henry," she repeated, feeling strange speaking so familiarly with a man she'd just met. Yet there was something about him that put her at ease, a steadiness that contrasted sharply with Edmund's volatile nature. After breakfast, Henry brought her a coat too large but warm, and they set out for town. He insisted she ride his horse while he walked alongside, leading the animal through the snow-covered path. The day was bright and clear, the sky an impossible blue against the white landscape. Victor had grown substantially since the first gold strike in the region. What had once been a scattering of tents was now a proper town with wooden buildings lining a main street. A general store, saloon, assay office, and several boarding houses served the needs of miners and the businesses that supported them. Mrs. Holloway runs the cleanest boarding house, Henry explained as they approached a two-story building with green shutters. Strict rules. No minors allowed upstairs, fair prices. Catherine nodded, suddenly nervous. The reality of her situation was sinking in. She had no money, no possessions beyond the clothes she wore, and no husband to provide for her. As if reading her thoughts, Henry spoke again. Victor needs a schoolteacher, the last one left before winter. You mentioned you were educated? Yes, Catherine said, surprised. I taught children in Philadelphia before I married. My father insisted I have a proper education, even if it wasn't fashionable for women. Mrs. Holloway is on the town council. I'll speak to her about it. Henry helped her dismount as they reached the boarding house. And until you get settled, I'll cover your room and board. Catherine felt a rush of gratitude mixed with embarrassment. Henry, I can't accept. You can and you will, he interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. Consider it an investment in Victor's future. We need educated people here, especially those willing to teach the young ones. Before she could respond, the door to the boarding house opened, revealing a plump woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled into a severe bun. Henry Garrett, the woman said, her stern expression softening slightly. Twice in 1 month you grace my doorstep. To what do I owe the pleasure? Mrs. Holloway, Henry removed his hat. This is Mrs. Catherine Tucker. She's had a difficult journey and needs lodging. She's also a trained teacher. Mrs. Holloway's eyebrows rose as she assessed Catherine with a critical eye. A teacher, you say? Come in, both of you. This conversation doesn't need to happen in the cold. Inside, the boarding house was warm and smelled of pine soap and fresh bread. Mrs. Holloway led them to a small parlor and offered tea, which Catherine accepted gratefully. Now then, Mrs. Holloway said after hearing a carefully edited version of Catherine's situation. We've been without a teacher since November. The children are running wild, and the parents are at their wits' end. If you're qualified and willing, I believe the town council would approve your appointment immediately. Hope flickered in Catherine's chest. I would be most grateful for the opportunity, Mrs. Holloway. The schoolhouse needs work, Mrs. Holloway warned. And the pay isn't much, but it includes living quarters above the classroom. Simple but private. When can I see it? Catherine asked, eager at the prospect of independence. This afternoon, if the roads are clear enough, Mrs. Holloway replied. For now, you'll stay here. I have a room available. She gave Henry a pointed look. And I'll thank you, Mr. Garrett, to remember my rules about gentlemen callers. Henry's face flushed slightly. Yes, madam, I'm well aware of your rules. After finalizing the arrangements, Henry prepared to leave. At the door, he hesitated. I'll come by tomorrow to see how you're settling in, he said, and to bring some supplies for the schoolhouse. It's been empty all winter. Thank you, Henry, Catherine said sincerely, for everything. He nodded once, placed his hat back on his head, and stepped outside into the bright winter day. Catherine watched him go, a strange mix of emotions swirling within her. In just one night and morning, her life had changed course completely. As she turned to follow Mrs. Holloway upstairs, She wondered what Edmund would think if he knew she was already finding her footing in the town he had been so eager to leave. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple one-room building with large windows and a small bell tower. Inside, dust covered every surface, and a family of mice had taken up residence in one corner. Catherine stood in the center of the room, mentally cataloging all that needed to be done before children could be taught here. "It's been neglected," Mrs. Holloway said apologetically. Miss Winters left rather suddenly when she received a proposal from a man in Denver. "It has potential," Catherine replied, moving to open the windows despite the cold. "Fresh air would do the place good. The structure seems sound." "The living quarters are upstairs," Mrs. Holloway continued, leading the way to a narrow staircase at the back of the room. Above the schoolroom was a small apartment, one main room serving as both sitting room and bedroom, plus a tiny kitchen. Like downstairs, everything was covered in dust, but Catherine could see the possibilities. A dormer window offered a view of the mountains, their snow-capped peaks glowing pink in the late afternoon light. "It's perfect," Catherine said, meaning it despite the work ahead. "When can I move in?" Mrs. Holloway looked surprised. "You'll need to clean it first, and there's no furniture except what was left behind a bed frame, table, and 2 chairs. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer to stay at the boarding house a while longer?" Catherine shook her head. "I've imposed on your hospitality enough. I'd like to make this space my own as soon as possible." The older woman nodded approvingly. "I admire your spirit, Mrs. Tucker. I'll send some of the town women to help you clean tomorrow. School can start the following Monday if you're ready." That evening, Catherine ate dinner in Mrs. Holloway's dining room alongside 4 other boarders, a clerk from the assay office, an elderly widow, and 2 sisters who worked as seamstresses. The conversation flowed around her, gossip about people she didn't know and places she hadn't seen, but it felt good to be among others after the isolation of the cabin she had shared with Edmund. "Is it true you're opening the school again?" asked one of the sisters, Clara, a pretty blonde with quick eyes. "Yes, as soon as the schoolhouse is habitable again," Catherine replied. "You're brave to live there alone," Clara's sister Betsy commented. "It's quite a distance from town." "Not so far," the clerk, Mr. Peterson, interjected. "And I hear Henry Garrett has taken an interest in our new teacher's welfare. He's not a man I'd want to cross." Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Garrett simply helped me when I was in need. There's nothing more to it." "Of course," Mr. Peterson said, though his knowing smile suggested he thought otherwise. "Still, you could do worse than catching the attention of one of the most prosperous ranchers in the territory." "That's quite enough, Mr. Peterson," Mrs. Holloway interrupted firmly. "Mrs. Tucker is newly arrived and recently separated from her husband. She deserves our respect and support, not idle speculation." The conversation shifted to safer topics after that, but Catherine found herself dwelling on Mr. Peterson's words. She had known Henry Garrett less than a day, yet already the town was weaving stories around them. It was the way of small communities, she supposed, but it made her uncomfortable nonetheless. Later, alone in her small room at the boarding house, Catherine sat by the window and watched as snowflakes began to fall again, gentler this time. She thought about Edmund and was surprised to find the sharp pain of his betrayal had dulled somewhat, replaced by a simmering anger and, beneath that, relief. Perhaps some part of her had known their marriage was built on sand, destined to crumble from the start. A knock at her door roused her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Mrs. Holloway stood there with a bundle in her arms. "Some essentials to get you started," the older woman said, handing over the package. "Linens, soap, a few kitchen items. The community takes care of its own, Mrs. Tucker." You'll find that's true even in a rough place like Victor. Catherine accepted the bundle, touched by the gesture. Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. I'm beginning to see that. After Mrs. Holloway left, Catherine unwrapped the bundle to find neatly folded sheets and towels, a bar of lavender soap, a small pot, a cup, and some basic utensils. There was also a note listing the names of women who would help clean the schoolhouse tomorrow. As she prepared for bed, Catherine felt a sense of purpose taking root within her. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she was making her own decisions, charting her own course. The path ahead would not be easy, but it was hers to walk as she chose, true to Mrs. Holloway's word. 6 women arrived at the schoolhouse the next morning, armed with brooms, mops, and determination. Catherine was overwhelmed by their generosity as they scrubbed floors, washed windows, and chased away mice with cheerful efficiency. "My Tommy's been driving me mad at home," confessed Mrs. Miller, a robust woman with 3 young children. "He needs schooling before he burns the house down with his experiments." "My Lily can already read a bit," Mrs. Hayes said proudly. "My mother taught me and I taught her, but she needs proper learning if she's to have any opportunities in this world." By midday, the schoolroom was transformed. Desks that had been stacked in a corner were arranged in neat rows. The blackboard was washed and ready for chalk. Someone had brought curtains for the windows, simple but clean, and another had donated a rag rug for the floor by the teacher's desk. As they broke for lunch, a communal affair of bread, cheese, and apples brought by the women, Catherine heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Looking out the window, she saw Henry Garrett pulling up outside, his wagon loaded with firewood and what appeared to be furniture. "Right on time," Mrs. Miller commented with a knowing smile. "Garrett's nothing if not reliable." Catherine went outside to greet him, suddenly conscious of her appearance, hair tied back with a ribbon, sleeves rolled up, apron dusty from cleaning. "Henry," she said, shading her eyes against the sun. "What's all this?" "Supplies," he replied simply, jumping down from the wagon. "Firewood to start, enough for a few weeks, and some pieces from my cabin. I don't use much, a rocking chair, bookshelf, and some kitchen things." He glanced toward the schoolhouse. "Looks like you've had help." "The women of Victor have been incredibly kind," Catherine said. "The classroom is almost ready for students." Henry nodded approvingly. "And your living quarters?" "That's our afternoon project," Catherine replied. "Though with everyone helping, it shouldn't take long. Then I'll bring these things upstairs before I unload the firewood." Before Catherine could protest, 2 of the women had come outside to help, and soon a procession was moving between wagon and schoolhouse, carrying Henry's contributions upstairs to Catherine's new home. The rocking chair was placed by the dormer window, the bookshelf against one wall. Henry had also brought blankets, a small writing desk, and various kitchen implements that made the sparse apartment feel more like a home. The women exclaimed over each item, their knowing glances not lost on Catherine. "Mr. Garrett," Mrs. Hayes said teasingly, "you seem quite invested in our new teacher's comfort." Henry's face remained impassive. "Just being neighborly, madam. It's a hard country. We all need to look out for each other." Mrs. Hayes replied, unconvinced. "Very neighborly indeed." By late afternoon, both schoolroom and living quarters were clean and organized. The women departed one by one, each extracting a promise from Catherine to visit their homes before school started so she could meet their children. Soon only Catherine and Henry remained. "Would you like some tea?" Catherine offered, gesturing toward her newly functional kitchen. "It's the least I can do to thank you." Henry hesitated, then nodded. "That would be welcome." While Catherine prepared the tea, Henry built a fire in the small stove. The domestic scene struck Catherine as strangely comfortable, as if they had done this dance many times before. "The town seems eager for the school to open," Catherine commented as they sat at her small table, steam rising from their cups. "Education matters out here," Henry replied. "These children will build the future of this territory. Parents know that, even if some of them never had schooling themselves." "And you?" Catherine asked. "Did you have much education?" A shadow crossed Henry's face. "More than some, less than others. My father was a schoolteacher back in Missouri before he took to farming. He made sure I could read, write, and cipher." "He sounds like a good man." "He was," Henry said softly. "Lost him and my mother both to fever when I was 16, came west soon after." Catherine felt a surge of sympathy. "I'm sorry, Henry. I still have my parents, though I doubt they'll speak to me now. They opposed my marriage to Edmund from the start." "Parents often see what we can't," Henry observed. "Or won't." They fell silent, sipping their tea and watching as the light began to fade outside the window. "I should go," Henry said eventually, rising from his chair. "Cattle need tending, even in winter." At the door he paused. "Town council meets tomorrow night. I'll make sure they formalize your appointment as teacher. Salary's not much, $30 a month, but as Mrs. Holloway said, it includes your housing." "It's more than enough," Catherine assured him. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." Henry studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're stronger than you know, Catherine Tucker. Your husband was a fool to leave you behind." Before she could respond, he was gone, his boots echoing on the stairs. Catherine stood in the doorway, watching as he loaded the empty wagon and drove away, his figure gradually disappearing as darkness fell. That night, alone in her new home, Catherine lay in bed listening to the creaks and groans of the unfamiliar building. Through the dormer window, stars glittered in a clear sky, so bright and numerous they seemed close enough to touch. She thought about Henry Garrett, about his quiet strength and unexpected kindness. She had no right to feel this strange pull toward him, not when her marriage, though abandoned, still legally existed. Yet as sleep finally claimed her, it was Henry's face she saw, not Edmund's, and for the first time in months, her dreams were peaceful. The first day of school arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. Catherine stood at the door of the schoolhouse, welcoming each child with a warm smile and a gentle greeting. By 9 o'clock, 23 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age had taken their seats, their expressions varying from excitement to trepidation to outright suspicion. "Good morning," Catherine said, moving to stand behind her desk. "My name is Mrs. Tucker, and I am honored to be your teacher." A small boy in the front row raised his hand immediately. "Are you really from Philadelphia?" he asked without waiting to be called upon. "Pa says that's farther away than the moon." Scattered giggles filled the room. Catherine smiled. "Yes, I am. And while Philadelphia is quite far, I assure you it's not quite as distant as the moon. What's your name?" "Tommy Miller, madam." "Well, Mr. Miller, in this classroom we raise our hands and wait to be called upon before speaking. But I appreciate your curiosity." The morning progressed with Catherine assessing the children's knowledge levels, which varied widely. Some of the older children had received sporadic education and could read and calculate reasonably well. Others, particularly the youngest, had never held a book before. By lunchtime, Catherine had divided the students into 3 groups based on ability rather than age, a decision that raised some eyebrows but made practical sense given the range of skills. The children ate their packed lunches at their desks while Catherine reviewed her notes and prepared for the afternoon lessons. A knock at the door interrupted her planning. To her surprise, Henry stood there, holding a small crate. "Hope I'm not disturbing your class," he said, glancing at the children who were now staring at him with undisguised interest. "We're on our lunch break," Catherine explained, conscious of the sudden hush that had fallen over the room. "What brings you to town on a Monday, Henry?" "Supply delivery," he replied, setting the crate on her desk. "Books from Denver. Town council ordered them last fall, but they only just arrived." Catherine opened the crate to find readers, arithmetic primers, and several volumes of history and science. "These are wonderful," she said sincerely. "Please thank the council for me." "Already did," Henry said with a slight smile. "They're pleased you've taken on the teaching position so quickly." One of the older boys, a lanky teenager named James Hayes, approached the desk. "Mr. Garrett, sir, is it true you fought off 3 rustlers single-handed last summer?" Henry's expression remained neutral, but Catherine thought she detected a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Stories tend to grow in the telling, son. It was 2 men, not 3, and I had help from my ranch hand." "Still mighty brave," the boy insisted, looking at Henry with undisguised admiration. "Bravery is doing what needs doing when it needs doing," Henry replied. "Nothing special about that." He turned back to Catherine. "I'll let you get back to your teaching, Mrs. Tucker." As he left, Catherine noticed the whispers and meaningful glances exchanged among the older girls. It seemed the interest in her relationship with Henry extended beyond the adult population of Victor. "Mrs. Tucker has an admirer," sang out one girl, perhaps 13, with long braids. "That's quite enough, Miss Johnson," Catherine said firmly. "Mr. Garrett is a friend who has been kind enough to help me settle into Victor. Now, let's return to our lessons." The afternoon passed quickly, and soon Catherine was standing at the door again, bidding farewell to her students. Several parents had come to collect the younger children, and Catherine took the opportunity to introduce herself and discuss their children's progress. As the last family departed, Catherine noticed a figure on horseback at the edge of town, too distant to identify clearly but stationary, as if watching. A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the winter air. Could it be Edmund, returned to reclaim her after his abandonment? She shook off the thought. It was far more likely to be a traveler or one of the local ranchers heading home after business in town. Besides, if Edmund had returned, he would have come directly to find her, not watched from a distance. Closing the door, Catherine turned her attention to preparing for tomorrow's lessons. The mysterious rider was forgotten as she immersed herself in planning how best to help her diverse group of students learn and grow. Days stretched into weeks as Catherine settled into her role as Victor's teacher. February gave way to March, bringing slightly warmer days though the nights remained bitterly cold. Catherine's students made progress at various rates, but all showed improvement under her patient guidance. Henry visited regularly, sometimes bringing supplies for the school, other times just stopping by to ensure Catherine had enough firewood or to help with minor repairs to the building. Their friendship deepened with each visit, their conversations ranging from books they had both read to their hopes for the territory's future. One Saturday in mid-March, Henry arrived with an unexpected proposal. "The snow's beginning to melt in the lower pastures," he said as they sat drinking coffee in Catherine's small kitchen. "I thought you might like to see my ranch. It's only an hour's ride from town." Catherine hesitated. Such an outing would certainly fuel the town's gossip, which had already linked their names despite their careful propriety. "I don't know, Henry," she said carefully. "It might not be appropriate." Henry's expression remained calm. "Mrs. Miller and her children will be joining us. She's bringing lunch as thanks for my helping repair their barn roof last week." Relief and, strangely, a touch of disappointment flooded through Catherine. "In that case, I'd be delighted to come." The following day dawned clear and mild by Colorado standards. Henry arrived in a wagon with Mrs. Miller and her 3 children, including Tommy from Catherine's class. The ride to the ranch took them through stunning scenery, snow-covered forests giving way to meadows, where the first hints of green were beginning to show through melting snow. Henry's ranch was larger than Catherine had imagined, a substantial log cabin, several outbuildings, a corral, and rolling pasture islands stretching toward distant mountains. Cattle dotted the landscape, their breath visible in the cool air. "It's beautiful," Catherine said as Henry helped her down from the wagon. "Took 4 years to build it to this point," Henry replied, a note of pride in his voice. "Started with just the cabin and 10 head of cattle." "And now," Catherine asked, looking at the prosperous spread before her. 200 cattle, 20 horses, and enough land to expand further when the time is right." Mrs. Miller herded her children toward a flat area near a stream where she began setting out their picnic. "Henry, show Catherine around while I get lunch ready." The tour revealed a well-organized operation. A Mexican ranch hand named Miguel managed the cattle with the help of 2 younger workers. The barn housed several fine horses, and a vegetable garden lay dormant under the melting snow, waiting for spring planting. "You've created something remarkable here," Catherine said as they walked back toward the picnic site. "It's a good life," Henry agreed. "Hard work but satisfying." He hesitated, then added, "Gets lonely sometimes." Before Catherine could respond to this loaded statement, Tommy came running up, demanding that Henry show them the new foal born just days earlier. The moment passed, but Catherine found herself thinking about it throughout their meal and on the journey back to town. That evening, alone in her quarters above the schoolhouse, Catherine faced an uncomfortable truth. She was developing feelings for Henry Garrett that went far beyond friendship or gratitude. It was too soon after Edmund's abandonment, too complicated given her still married status, and yet she couldn't deny the warmth that filled her when Henry was near or the way she looked forward to his visits. "This is foolishness," she told herself firmly. "You're still Edmund Tucker's wife, legally if not in practice." Yet as she prepared for bed, Catherine wondered if there might be a way to move forward, to legally end her marriage to a man who had so clearly ended it in every way that mattered. The territorial courts granted divorces for abandonment, she knew, though the process could be lengthy and potentially scandalous. Sleep eluded her as she weighed her options, her heart and mind at war over the proper course of action. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were a confused jumble of faces: Edmund's, Henry's, and her parents', all watching her with expressions she couldn't quite read. The mysterious rider Catherine had glimpsed weeks earlier materialized again one afternoon in early April as school was dismissing. This time he was closer, and Catherine could see it was not Edmund but a stranger, a rough-looking man with a weathered face and clothes that had seen better days. "Can I help you?" she called as the last of her students departed with their parents. The man nudged his horse forward. "Looking for Edmund Tucker. Heard he had a claim near here." Catherine's heart raced. "Mr. Tucker is no longer in Victor. He left nearly 2 months ago, heading toward Pikes Peak." The man frowned. "You his wife?" "I am," Catherine acknowledged cautiously. "May I ask why you're looking for my husband?" "Business matter," the man said vaguely. "Name's Silas Watkins. Your husband and I had an arrangement about a mining claim. He owes me money." Catherine sighed. This was hardly surprising. Edmund had always been quick to enter into deals without considering the consequences. "I'm afraid I can't help you, Mr. Watkins. As I said, my husband left some time ago." Watkins studied her, his gaze making Catherine uncomfortable. "Abandoned you, did he?" "That's a shame for a pretty woman like yourself." His tone made the compliment sound like something else entirely. "If you'll excuse me, I have work to do," Catherine said firmly, turning toward the schoolhouse door. "I'll be staying at the saloon for a few days," Watkins called after her. "In case you hear from your husband, or in case you get lonely." Catherine closed the door without responding, her hands shaking slightly. Something about Silas Watkins unsettled her deeply. She debated whether to mention his visit to anyone, and decided Henry should know, not because she needed his protection, she told herself, but because he seemed to know most of what happened in and around Victor. The opportunity came the next day when Henry stopped by the schoolhouse after classes with a delivery of firewood. Catherine recounted her conversation with Watkins, watching as Henry's expression darkened. "I know the type," he said grimly. "Likely trying to claim territory that isn't his through intimidation." He stacked another log on the woodpile. "Has he bothered you again?" "No," Catherine replied, "but Mrs. Miller mentioned seeing him watching the schoolhouse this morning." Henry straightened, dusting his hands on his trousers. "I'll have a word with him. Men like that understand only one language. Please don't put yourself at risk on my account," Catherine said quickly. "He'll likely move on when he realizes Edmund isn't returning." "Perhaps," Henry conceded, "but until then you shouldn't be alone here." He glanced around the schoolroom. "Why not stay at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house for a few days?" Catherine shook her head. "This is my home now. I won't be driven from it by fear." She smiled at Henry's concerned expression. "But I appreciate your concern." That evening, Catherine was grading papers by lamplight when a knock came at the schoolhouse door. Cautious after her encounter with Watkins, she called out, "Who is it?" before approaching the door. "Miguel, Señora, from Señor Garrett's ranch." Relieved, Catherine opened the door to find Henry's ranch hand standing there, his hat in his hands. "Miguel, is everything all right?" "Señora. Señor Garrett asked me to watch over the schoolhouse tonight." He looked embarrassed. From a distance, of course, for propriety. Catherine felt a rush of warmth at Henry's thoughtfulness. "That's very kind, but not necessary." Miguel shrugged. "Señor Garrett says it is necessary, and what he says I do. He is a good man, Señora, the best I have worked for." "Yes," Catherine agreed softly. "I believe he is." She hesitated, then added, "There's coffee on the stove if you'd like some before you begin your watching." Miguel accepted the offer gratefully, and as they sat at one of the student desks with their cups, he told Catherine stories about his 3 years working for Henry, how Henry had taught him English, paid him fair wages when others wouldn't hire a Mexican, and treated him with respect few others showed. After Miguel left to take up his discreet post somewhere outside, Catherine returned to her grading, her heart lighter despite the situation with Watkins. Knowing Henry cared enough to send protection without making her feel helpless meant more than she could express. The confrontation Catherine had been dreading came 2 days later. She was working in the small garden behind the schoolhouse, taking advantage of the spring sunshine when a shadow fell across her. Looking up, she found Silas Watkins standing there, his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Afternoon, Mrs. Tucker," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thought I'd stop by to see if you'd reconsidered helping me locate your husband." Catherine stood, brushing soil from her hands. "As I told you before, Mr. Watkins, I have no information about my husband's whereabouts. He didn't confide in me before leaving." Watkins took a step closer. "That's a shame. Man shouldn't leave his pretty wife all alone. Makes me think maybe he wouldn't mind if someone else kept her company." Catherine backed away, her heart pounding. "You should leave, Mr. Watkins." "Should I?" Watkins reached out to touch her cheek. "I'm not convinced of that." Before his hand could make contact, another voice cut through the tension. "The lady asked you to leave." Henry stood at the corner of the schoolhouse, his stance casual but his eyes hard as flint. Behind him, Miguel and another ranch hand waited, their presence a clear warning. Watkins turned slowly. "This ain't your business, Garrett. Miss Tucker is under my protection," Henry said evenly. "That makes it my business." A tense silence stretched between the men. Catherine could see Watkins calculating his odds against Henry and his men. Finally, he stepped back. "No need for trouble," he said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Just having a friendly conversation with the lady." "Conversation's over," Henry replied. "And if I see you near the schoolhouse again, we'll have a different kind of conversation. One you won't enjoy." Watkins's face flushed with anger, but he backed away. "I'll be seeing you, Mrs. Tucker. Count on it." With that parting shot, he mounted his horse and rode toward town. Catherine released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you, Henry." His timing was unfortunate. Henry's expression softened as he turned to her. "Are you all right?" "Yes, just shaken." Catherine brushed a strand of hair from her face. "How did you happen to arrive at exactly the right moment?" "Tommy Miller saw Watkins heading this way and ran to fetch me in town." Henry glanced toward his men. "Miguel, Juan, thank you for your help. Would you mind checking the perimeter of the schoolyard before you go?" As the men moved off to follow his instructions, Henry turned back to Catherine. "This situation isn't going to resolve itself. Watkins is trouble and he's fixated on you now, not just your husband." "What do you suggest?" Catherine asked, trusting Henry's judgment in this matter. "The spring cattle drive to Denver leaves next week. I'm leading it." Henry met her eyes directly. "Come with us. We'll file for divorce in the territorial court there, on grounds of abandonment." Catherine stared at him, taken aback by the unexpected suggestion. "Henry, just hear me out," he continued quickly. "The drive takes 10 days. We'll have a chuck wagon with a covered section where you can sleep privately. Mrs. Miller's agreed to come as cook, so your reputation would be protected. Once in Denver, you could stay with my sister Elizabeth while the divorce is processed." "You've thought this through quite thoroughly," Catherine observed, both touched and somewhat amused by his detailed planning. "I care about your safety," Henry said simply, "and your happiness." The sincerity in his voice made Catherine's heart beat faster. "A divorce would take months, perhaps longer if Edmund contests it." "He abandoned you in the dead of winter," Henry pointed out. "Any judge would see that as grounds. And from what you've told me of Edmund Tucker, he's more likely to be relieved than contested." Catherine nodded slowly, considering the proposal. "What about the school, the children? Term ends in 2 weeks. The timing works well." Henry smiled slightly. "I may have consulted with Mrs. Holloway before suggesting this." Of course he had. Henry Garrett never acted without considering all angles. It was one of the many things Catherine had come to admire about him. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. Henry nodded. "Of course, but don't take too long." The drive leaves Tuesday next. That evening, Catherine paced her small apartment, weighing her options. Staying in Victor meant facing Watkins's continued harassment and living in the shadow of Edmund's abandonment. Going to Denver offered the chance for a fresh start, legal freedom from a marriage that existed now only on paper. And there was Henry. Catherine could no longer deny her feelings for him, nor could she ignore the signs that he felt the same. But they were both honorable people who would not act on those feelings while she remained legally bound to another. By morning, her decision was made. She would go to Denver, file for divorce, and see what future might be possible once she was truly free. When Henry came by the schoolhouse that afternoon, Catherine was ready with her answer. "Yes," she said before he could even ask the question. "I'll go to Denver with the cattle drive." Relief washed over Henry's face. "You won't regret it, Catherine, I promise you that." As he turned to leave, Catherine called after him, "Henry." When he looked back, she added softly, "Thank you for caring what happens to me." His expression gentled. "Always have. Always will." The preparations for the cattle drive consumed the next week. Catherine informed her students and their parents that school would dismiss early for summer break, citing personal business in Denver. If anyone suspected the true nature of that business, they were kind enough not to mention it. Mrs. Miller proved an invaluable ally, helping Catherine pack appropriate clothing for the journey and offering practical advice about life on a cattle drive. "It won't be comfortable," she warned as they sorted through Catherine's limited wardrobe. "Dusty, sometimes wet, always exhausting. But there's a freedom to it that's hard to find elsewhere." "Like teaching," Catherine mused, "difficult but rewarding in unexpected ways." Mrs. Miller smiled knowingly. "Henry Garrett is a good man, Catherine. The best in these parts, if you ask me. Whatever happens in Denver, remember that." Catherine flushed, but didn't deny the implication. "I'm still married, Margaret." "For now," the other woman replied with a shrug. "Life's too short and too hard out here to ignore a chance at happiness when it presents itself." The day of departure arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures, good omens for the journey ahead. The cattle, nearly 300 head, were gathered in a meadow outside town, attended by 6 cowboys including Henry, Miguel, and Juan. The chuck wagon stood ready, loaded with supplies for the journey. Catherine said goodbye to Mrs. Holloway, who surprised her with an unexpected embrace. "You come back to us when you're ready," the older woman said firmly. "Victor needs its teacher." "I will," Catherine promised, touched by the woman's concern. "Thank you for everything." As Catherine climbed onto the seat of the chuck wagon beside Mrs. Miller, she saw a familiar figure watching from the edge of town. Silas Watkins, his expression unreadable at this distance. A chill ran through her, but she pushed aside her unease. Soon she would be far from Victor and the threat Watkins represented. Henry rode up beside the wagon, looking every inch the cattle baron in his practical trail clothes and wide-brimmed hat. "Ready, ladies, as will ever be, Mrs. Miller replied cheerfully. "Let's get these beasts to market before we're all too old to enjoy the profits." With a laugh, Henry signaled to his men, and the drive began. Hundreds of cattle moving slowly eastward, guided by skilled riders and accompanied by the creaking chuck wagon that carried Catherine toward an uncertain but hopeful future. The first days on the trail established a routine. Catherine woke before dawn to help Mrs. Miller prepare breakfast for the cowboys. While the men ate, she and Mrs. Miller would pack up the cooking equipment, then ride ahead with Juan as escort to establish the midday camp while the herd moved at its steady pace. The work was hard but satisfying, and Catherine found herself enjoying the open spaces and changing landscape as they moved across the territory. At night, after dinner was served and cleaned up, she would retire to the covered section of the chuck wagon while Mrs. Miller slept near the fire with the men, her 3 children nestled beside her. Henry maintained a respectful distance during daylight hours, his focus on managing the herd and his men. But each evening, he would check on Catherine, their conversations becoming the highlight of her day. On the 5th night, as they sat a little apart from the others, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Henry spoke of his hopes for the future. "I want to build a proper house," he said, his voice low enough that only Catherine could hear. "The cabin served me well, but it's time for something more permanent. 2 stories, glass windows, a proper kitchen." "It sounds wonderful," Catherine replied, trying to ignore the implications behind his words. "Your ranch deserves a house to match its success." Henry turned to look at her directly. "A house needs a woman's touch to become a home. The statement hung between them, its meaning clear. Catherine's heart raced, but she forced herself to respond cautiously. "Henry, I know," he interrupted gently. "You're still married, I respect that. But when that's no longer the case." He left the sentence unfinished, the possibility hovering in the night air. Catherine reached out impulsively and touched his hand. "When that's no longer the case, we can have this conversation properly." His fingers closed around hers briefly before he released her hand and stood. "That's all I ask. Good night, Catherine." "Good night, Henry." As he walked back toward the campfire, Catherine remained seated, her thoughts in turmoil. She hadn't expected to find love again so soon after Edmund's betrayal. Yet here it was, growing stronger with each passing day. Henry Garrett was everything Edmund was not: steady, honest, considerate, a man whose word was his bond. For the first time since that freezing night when Edmund had abandoned her, Catherine allowed herself to imagine a future filled with happiness rather than mere survival. The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. On the 8th day of the drive, disaster struck. A sudden thunderstorm swept across the plain, lightning splitting the sky and thunder causing the cattle to grow restless. Despite the cowboys' best efforts, a lightning strike near the herd triggered a stampede. Catherine and Mrs. Miller watched in horror from the relative safety of the chuck wagon as hundreds of cattle broke into a panicked run, the cowboys racing alongside trying to turn the leaders and control the chaos. "Henry!" Catherine cried, spotting him at the edge of the stampede, his horse running flat out as he attempted to reach the front of the herd. A bolt of lightning illuminated the scene in stark relief: the terrified cattle, the determined riders, and Henry, suddenly flying through the air as his horse stumbled and went down. He disappeared beneath the pounding hooves of the cattle rushing past. No. Catherine was moving before she realized it, jumping down from the wagon despite Mrs. Miller's shouts of warning. Rain pelted her face as she ran toward where she had last seen Henry, heedless of the danger from the remaining cattle still streaming past. Juan intercepted her, grabbing her around the waist and forcibly turning her back toward the wagon. "Too dangerous, Senora. You cannot help him this way. Let me go." Catherine struggled against his hold. "Henry's down. He needs help." "The others will find him," Juan insisted, half carrying her back to safety. "You must wait. Por favor, Senora." The next hours were the longest of Catherine's life. The stampede was eventually controlled, the cattle regrouped and settled. As rain continued to fall, Miguel and 2 other cowboys searched the trampled ground for their boss. Catherine paced beside the wagon, ignoring Mrs. Miller's attempts to make her sit down or take shelter from the rain. Her dress was soaked through, her hair plastered to her skull, but she barely noticed. All her thoughts were with Henry, praying he had somehow survived the trampling hooves. Finally, through the curtain of rain, she saw 3 riders approaching slowly, one of them supporting a 4th figure slumped in the saddle before him. As they drew closer, Catherine recognized Henry's form and her heart leaped into her throat. "Is he?" She couldn't finish the question as Miguel dismounted and helped ease Henry down from the horse. "Alive, Senora," Miguel confirmed grimly, "but badly hurt." They carried Henry to the chuck wagon, laying him on Catherine's bedroll in the covered section. In the lantern light, Catherine could see the extent of his injuries: a deep gash across his forehead, his right arm hanging at an unnatural angle, and blood seeping through his shirt from what appeared to be broken ribs that had punctured the skin. "We need to get him to a doctor," Catherine said, her teacher's authority asserting itself through her fear. "How far to the nearest town?" 12 miles to Cedar Ridge," Miguel answered, "but the trail will be mud after this rain." The wagon would be slow, and the jolting could kill him if the ribs have pierced his lungs. Catherine made a swift decision. Miguel, you and I will take Henry to Cedar Ridge on horseback. Mrs. Miller can continue with the herd at a slower pace. Miguel looked doubtful. Senora, the trail is dangerous, especially at night. We have no choice, Catherine interrupted. He'll die without medical attention. The urgency in her voice convinced him. Within half an hour, they had Henry secured on Miguel's strongest horse, supported by Catherine, who rode behind him, her arms around his waist to keep him upright. Miguel led the way, a lantern held high to illuminate the treacherous trail. The journey was a nightmare of mud, rain, and Henry's increasingly labored breathing. Twice Catherine thought they had lost him when he slumped completely against her, but each time she called his name urgently until he stirred, clinging to consciousness by sheer force of will. "Stay with me, Henry," she murmured against his ear as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. "I need you to stay with me. Do you hear? I need you." Whether he understood her words or not, Henry seemed to respond to her voice, his breathing steadying somewhat whenever she spoke to him. Dawn was breaking when they finally reached Cedar Ridge, a small settlement with a single main street lined with wooden buildings. Miguel rode ahead to locate the doctor while Catherine struggled to keep Henry upright, her arms aching from supporting his weight for hours. Dr. Samuel Wilson proved to be a blessing, competent, sober, and quick to act despite the early hour. With Miguel's help, he carried Henry into his small clinic and immediately began assessing his injuries. Broken arm 3, possibly 4 broken ribs, one penetrating the chest wall but not the lung, thank God, the doctor muttered as he worked. Concussion from the head wound. Internal bruising, certainly. He's lucky to be alive. Will he recover? Catherine asked, her voice small with fear. Dr. Wilson glanced up at her, his eyes kind beneath bushy eyebrows. Hard to say for certain, but he's young and strong. If infection doesn't set in, his chances are good. He paused in his examination. You his wife? The question caught Catherine off guard. No, we're traveling together to Denver with a cattle drive. The doctor nodded without comment and returned to his work. There's a boarding house down the street. You should get some rest while I tend to him. Nothing you can do here for now. But Catherine shook her head. I'm staying. Something in her tone must have convinced him not to argue. Suit yourself. There's a chair in the corner. Try not to get in my way. For the next 3 days, Catherine barely left Henry's side. She bathed his feverish brow, helped the doctor change his bandages, and spoke to him continuously even when he was unconscious, telling him stories about her childhood in Philadelphia, her students in Victor, and her dreams for the future, dreams that increasingly included him. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Mrs. Miller arrived with the children and cattle drive, having pushed on to Cedar Ridge once the storm passed. She took one look at Catherine's exhausted face and ordered her to the boarding house for proper rest. You'll be no good to Henry if you collapse, she said firmly. I'll sit with him for a few hours. Doctor says the fever's breaking anyway. Reluctantly, Catherine allowed herself to be led to the boarding house where she slept for 12 straight hours. When she returned to the clinic, she found Henry awake, pale but alert, his eyes finding hers the moment she entered the room. Catherine, he said, his voice weak but clear. Miguel told me what you did, riding through the night, keeping me alive. She moved to his bedside, taking his uninjured hand in hers. You would have done the same for me. A ghost of his familiar smile touched his lips. In a heartbeat, his fingers tightened around hers. Thank you. Catherine felt tears threatening and blinked them back. The doctor says you'll recover fully given time and proper care. And the herd, safe. Juan and the others kept them together after the stampede. They're resting outside town now. Henry nodded slightly, wincing at the movement. Good men. His eyes held hers. The drive must continue. The cattle need to reach Denver on schedule for the contracts to be honored. Miguel can lead it, Catherine suggested. You're in no condition to travel. No, Henry agreed, but I don't need to travel with the herd. Once I'm strong enough to sit a wagon, we can take the stage to Denver. Be there waiting when the cattle arrive. Relief washed over Catherine. She hadn't wanted to leave Henry behind, but neither could she abandon the journey to Denver and her chance at divorce. Dr. Wilson says you'll be fit for wagon travel in about a week, she told him. We can book passage on the eastbound stage then. Henry's eyes were growing heavy, the conversation taxing his limited strength. Stay with me, he asked, his voice fading. Always, Catherine promised, settling into the chair beside his bed. As Henry drifted back to sleep, she realized the truth of her words. Wherever life took them after Denver, she intended to stay at Henry's side if he would have her. True to Dr. Wilson's prediction, Henry was able to travel by the end of the week, though movement clearly caused him pain. The cattle drive had continued on with Miguel in charge, taking the herd the remaining distance to Denver. Mrs. Miller and her children had gone with them, promising to meet Catherine and Henry in the city. The stagecoach journey was grueling despite the relatively short distance. Every bump and jolt in the road made Henry clench his jaw against the pain, though he never complained. Catherine did what she could to make him comfortable, supporting his splinted arm and providing a shoulder for him to lean against when the motion became too much. By the time they reached Denver, Henry was pale and sweating, his strength completely spent. Catherine took charge, finding them rooms at a modest hotel and sending for a doctor to check Henry's bandages after the journey. You should rest tomorrow, Catherine insisted as she helped Henry settle into his bed. Your sister isn't expecting us until the day after anyway. You're a formidable nurse, Henry observed, a hint of his usual humor returning despite his exhaustion. I'm beginning to feel sorry for any student who crosses you. Catherine smiled, relieved to see glimpses of his spirit returning. Rest now. I'll bring you some broth later. Denver in 1860 was a bustling frontier city, worlds away from the small mining town of Victor. As Henry recovered his strength over the next few days, Catherine explored the city, marveling at the relative civilization after months in the wilderness. There were proper shops, restaurants, even a theater advertising performances of Shakespeare. Most importantly for Catherine's purposes, Denver housed the territorial court where she could file for divorce. With Henry's sister, Elizabeth's help, a practical woman who had moved to Denver 5 years earlier with her merchant husband Catherine, navigated the legal process, submitting a petition citing Edmund's abandonment as grounds for dissolution of the marriage. It will take time, Elizabeth warned as they left the courthouse. 3 months at minimum, possibly longer if your husband contests it. Edmund won't contest it, Catherine said with certainty. He's likely forgotten he ever had a wife by now. Elizabeth smiled sympathetically. From what Henry's told me, you're well rid of him. She linked her arm through Catherine's as they walked along the boardwalk. My brother, on the other hand, seems quite taken with you. Catherine felt her cheeks warm. Henry has been very kind. Kind, Elizabeth laughed softly. Catherine, I've known my brother all his life. I've never seen him look at any woman the way he looks at you. Before Catherine could respond, they rounded a corner and nearly collided with a man coming from the opposite direction. Catherine's apology died on her lips as she recognized the face before her. Edmund, she whispered, shock rendering her momentarily speechless. Edmund Tucker looked as surprised as she felt, his handsome face registering confusion before settling into his familiar, charming smile. Catherine. What an extraordinary coincidence. He looked different, better dressed than when he had left her, with a gold watch chain visible across his waistcoat and a beaver hat that must have cost at least $20. Clearly, his fortunes had improved since his departure from Victor. Not so extraordinary, Catherine found her voice at last. Denver is where most business in the territory is conducted. Edmund's eyes darted to Elizabeth, then back to Catherine. Indeed, are you visiting someone? I'm staying with friends while I attend to legal matters, Catherine replied coolly. And you? Have you found the fortune you abandoned me for? A flicker of discomfort crossed Edmund's face before his smile reasserted itself. I've had some success, yes. A partnership in a promising claim near Central City. He hesitated, then added, I've thought about you, Catherine, wondered how you were faring. Have you? Catherine's tone made it clear she didn't believe him. Not enough to send word, apparently, or money. Edmund had the grace to look ashamed. I meant to write. Time got away from me. 3 months got away from you. Catherine felt anger rising, hot and cleansing after months of hurt and uncertainty. You left me in a cabin with dying embers and no provisions in the dead of winter, Edmund. I nearly froze to death that night. Elizabeth squeezed Catherine's arm in silent support as Edmund shifted uncomfortably under her accusation. I'm sorry, Catherine, truly. It was wrong of me. He glanced around, lowering his voice. Perhaps we could discuss this privately, over dinner tonight. Before Catherine could respond, another voice joined the conversation. I believe the lady has plans this evening. Henry stood behind them, steadier on his feet than he had been but still clearly recovering from his injuries. The splint on his arm and bandages visible at his collar told their own story of recent trauma. Edmund looked between Catherine and Henry, his expression calculating. I see. And you are, Henry Garrett, Henry replied evenly. Catherine's friend. Something in Henry's tone made Edmund's eyebrows rise slightly. I'm Edmund Tucker, Catherine's husband. I'm aware, Henry said, his voice cool but controlled. I'm also aware you abandoned her to freeze to death while you chased gold. Lucky for her, I happened along before the cold could claim her. Edmund bristled at the accusation. My personal matters with my wife are none of your concern, sir. They became my concern the moment I found her half dead in the snow, Henry replied, his calm facade cracking slightly to reveal the anger beneath. And they're now the court's concern as well, since Catherine has filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment. Edmund's eyes widened, then narrowed as he turned to Catherine. Is this true? Yes, Catherine met his gaze steadily. Our marriage ended the night you left, Edmund. I'm simply making it legal now. For a moment, Edmund looked genuinely hurt, and Catherine felt a twinge of the affection that had once led her to marry him. But it passed quickly, replaced by the memory of that cold night and the weeks of struggle that followed. I see. Edmund straightened his shoulders. Well, if that's what you want, I won't stand in your way. I'll inform the court tomorrow that I don't contest the divorce. Relief flooded through Catherine. Thank you, Edmund. He nodded stiffly, then cast an assessing look at Henry. I hope you know what you're doing, Catherine. The frontier is no place for a woman alone. She's not alone, Henry said simply, moving to stand beside Catherine. Edmund's gaze flickered between them, understanding dawning in his eyes. Without another word, he tipped his hat and continued down the boardwalk, his straight back and quick stride suggesting injured pride rather than genuine heartbreak. Elizabeth released a breath. Well, that was fortuitous. If he doesn't contest it, the divorce could be granted within weeks rather than months. Catherine barely heard her attention focused on Henry. You shouldn't be out of bed yet. The doctor said, I was worried when you didn't return, Henry interrupted. Elizabeth's husband told me where you'd gone. He smiled slightly. Seems I arrived just in time. You have a habit of doing that, Catherine replied softly. The weeks that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Catherine. Edmond was true to his word, submitting papers to the court stating he did not contest the divorce. The judge, sympathetic to Catherine's story of abandonment, expedited the proceedings, and by early June she was legally free. Henry's cattle had arrived in Denver with Miguel and the others, fetching an excellent price at market that more than covered the expenses of the drive. His injuries continued to heal, though the doctor warned it would be several more weeks before he could undertake the journey back to Victor. They settled into a comfortable routine during their extended stay in Denver. Elizabeth and her husband James welcomed them into their home, a spacious house near the center of the city. During the days, Catherine explored Denver with Elizabeth or visited the small school where her new friend taught, observing classes and gathering ideas for her own teaching. In the evenings, the four of them would dine together, discussing the day's events and plans for the future. As Henry's strength returned, he began accompanying Catherine on afternoon walks through the city parks, their conversations flowing easily from books they had both enjoyed to dreams they shared. It was during one such walk, 3 days after Catherine's divorce became final, that Henry finally spoke of what had been growing between them since that winter night on the road to Victor. They had paused beside a small pond, watching ducks glide across the water's surface. The June air was warm, scented with flowering trees and new grass. Henry had been quiet for several minutes, seemingly lost in thought. "I've been thinking about that house I want to build," he finally said, his gaze still on the water. 2 stories, glass windows, proper kitchen. Catherine smiled. "It sounds lovely. It would be." Henry turned to face her. With the right person sharing it, Catherine's heart quickened. "Henry, let me finish," he said gently. "The night I found you in the snow, you said something I'll never forget. You said he left me in the cold and I promised you'd never freeze again." He took her hands in his. "I meant it then and I mean it now. I want to spend my life keeping that promise, Catherine." Tears blurred Catherine's vision. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Henry smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his face. "I'm asking if you'll marry me, Catherine Tucker, if you'll help me build that house and a life and a family, if you'll let me love you the way you deserve to be loved completely and forever." Catherine didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Henry, I'll marry you." Henry gathered her into his arms, mindful of his still healing ribs, and kissed her with all the tenderness and passion she had dreamed of during those long weeks of waiting. When they finally parted, both breathing quickly, Catherine laughed with pure joy. "I think I started falling in love with you that very first night," she admitted. "Even half frozen and heartbroken, something in me recognized something in you." "I know I did," Henry replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You were the bravest, most stubborn woman I'd ever met, arguing with me even as I was trying to save your life." They walked back to Elizabeth's house hand in hand, plans and hopes tumbling over each other in their excitement. They would marry in Denver before returning to Victor. They would build the house Henry had described on his ranch. They would combine their dreams, his ranch and her school, into a shared vision for the future. Elizabeth's delight at their news was surpassed only by her declaration that she had known all along this would happen, and her immediate commencement of wedding preparations. James offered to stand as Henry's best man, while Elizabeth would be Catherine's matron of honor. 2 weeks later, on a perfect summer morning, Catherine and Henry were married in Denver's small stone church. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by Elizabeth and James, Mrs. Miller and her children, who had delayed their return to Victor for the occasion, Miguel, and several of the cowboys from the cattle drive. As they exchanged vows, Catherine thought of that freezing night that had brought them together, and how what had seemed like an ending had in fact been a beginning. Edmund's abandonment, painful as it was, had led her to this moment, to this man who looked at her with such love in his eyes as he promised to cherish her all the days of his life. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said, and Henry's kiss sealed their union as the small gathering applauded. The journey back to Victor was made in stages to accommodate Henry's continued recovery. They traveled by stagecoach, stopping for several days at comfortable inns along the route. These days became their honeymoon, time spent discovering each other as husband and wife rather than friends moving carefully around unspoken feelings. Catherine learned that Henry was as gentle and considerate a lover as he was a man, patient with her inexperience and dedicated to her pleasure. For her part, Catherine discovered a passion within herself that Edmund had never awakened, a desire not just for physical closeness, but for the deep emotional connection she shared with Henry. "I never knew it could be like this," she confessed one night, curled against his side in the darkness of their room. "So complete." Henry kissed her forehead. "This is only the beginning, my love. We have a lifetime to learn each other." When they finally returned to Victor in mid-July, the town turned out to welcome them home and celebrate their marriage. Mrs. Holloway hosted a reception at the boarding house, and Catherine was touched by the genuine affection shown by the townspeople who had accepted her so completely in her short time among them. Summer turned to fall, and fall to winter as Catherine and Henry settled into married life. True to her word, Catherine reopened the school in September, now commuting daily from Henry's ranch, where they lived in the cabin while plans for their new house were developed. Construction began in the spring of 1861, and by Christmas of that year, they were able to move into the first floor of their new home, a handsome two-story structure with large windows that looked out over the ranch and distant mountains. As Henry had promised, there was a proper kitchen, a dining room for entertaining, and a study where Catherine prepared her lessons. Life settled into a rhythm marked by the seasons and the work that sustained them. Henry's ranch prospered under his careful management, expanding to include more land and cattle. Catherine's school grew as well, eventually requiring a second teacher as Victor's population increased with the continued mining operations. In the summer of 1862, Catherine discovered she was expecting their first child. Henry's joy at the news was boundless, his protectiveness both touching and occasionally amusing as he fretted over her continuing to teach. "The baby isn't due until February," Catherine reminded him as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "I can certainly manage until Christmas." Henry placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "Our child is lucky to have such a determined mother." "And such a devoted father," Catherine added, covering his hand with her own. Their son, William James Garrett, was born on a clear, cold February day in 1863, almost exactly 3 years after Catherine and Henry first met. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and from his first lusty cries, it was clear he had inherited both their strong wills. As Catherine held her son in her arms, Henry sitting beside them on their bed, she thought about the journey that had brought them here from that desperate night in the snow to this moment of perfect happiness. "What are you thinking?" Henry asked, gently stroking William's tiny head. "I was thinking about promises kept," Catherine replied, looking up at her husband with eyes full of love. "You said I'd never freeze again, and you were right." Henry smiled, the same smile that had first warmed her heart on that cold winter night. "And I never will, as long as I have you both to come home to." Outside, snow began to fall, covering the landscape in a pristine blanket of white. But inside the Garrett home, all was warmth and love and the promise of a future as boundless as the Colorado sky. In the years that followed, the Garrett family grew and flourished. William was joined by a sister, Elizabeth Margaret, in 1865, and another brother, Thomas Henry, in 1868. Each child brought new joy to the household and strengthened the bond between Catherine and Henry, whose love deepened with each passing year. The ranch expanded to become one of the largest and most successful in the territory, supplying beef not only to mining communities but to Denver and beyond, as the railroad made shipping to eastern markets possible. Henry's reputation for fair dealing and quality livestock made the Garrett brand respected throughout Colorado. Catherine continued teaching until the birth of Elizabeth, when the demands of motherhood and the ranch made it impractical. Instead, she focused her educational efforts on her own children and the children of ranch workers, creating a small school in a converted outbuilding on the property. Victor grew as well, transforming from a rough mining town into a more established community. The Garretts were respected members of that community, contributing to the building of a proper church, supporting the expansion of the school where Catherine had once taught, and helping neighbors through hard times. There were challenges, of course. The winter of 1866 was particularly harsh, with blizzards that threatened the cattle and isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. A fire in 1870 destroyed one of the barns, though quick action by Henry and his men prevented it from spreading to the house or other buildings. And there were the normal difficulties of life on the frontier: illness, accidents, and the constant work required to maintain their way of life. Through it all, Catherine and Henry faced each obstacle together, their partnership stronger for the trials they weathered. They never forgot the circumstances that had brought them together, sometimes retelling the story to their wide-eyed children on winter evenings by the fire. "And then Papa found Mama in the snow," William would ask, though he had heard the story many times. "He did," Catherine would confirm. "Just when I needed him most. And I said she would never freeze again," Henry would add, his arm around Catherine's shoulders. "The best promise I ever made." Edmund Tucker faded into memory, occasionally mentioned in news from Denver, where he had indeed made his fortune in mining investments. He never remarried, devoting himself instead to business ventures throughout the territory. Once, in 1872, he passed through Victor and stopped at the general store where Catherine was shopping with 12-year-old William. The meeting was brief and awkward, Edmund clearly surprised by the sight of Catherine with a nearly grown son. He was polite but distant, congratulating her on her family before quickly taking his leave. As Catherine watched him go, she felt nothing but a vague gratitude for the twist of fate that had led him to abandon her that winter night, setting her on the path to true happiness. By 1880, 20 years after Henry and Catherine first met, their home was the center of a thriving ranch operation that employed over a dozen men year-round. William, now 17, worked alongside his father, learning every aspect of the business he would someday inherit. Elizabeth, 15, showed her mother's intelligence and determination, excelling in her studies and already speaking of attending college in Denver or perhaps even back east. Thomas, 12, was the dreamer of the family, more interested in books and drawing than ranching, though he loved the land as much as his siblings. On a particular winter evening, with snow falling gently outside and a fire crackling in the hearth of their comfortable home, Catherine sat with her mending while Henry read aloud from a new novel. The children were engaged in their own activities, William reviewing cattle breeding records, Elizabeth practicing on the piano they had imported from St. Louis, Thomas sketching in the notebook Catherine had given him for Christmas. Catherine looked up from her work, taking in the scene of domestic tranquility, and felt a wave of contentment wash over her. This was what happiness looked like, not grand passions or dramatic gestures, but the quiet accumulation of days spent loving and being loved, building something lasting together. As if sensing her thoughts, Henry paused in his reading and met her gaze across the room. The years had added silver to his hair and lines around his eyes, but when he smiled at her, Catherine saw the same man who had lifted her from the snow that night long ago. 20 years, he said softly, for her ears alone. Best 20 years of my life. Catherine smiled back, her heart as full as it had been on their wedding day. And many more to come. Outside, the Colorado winter wrapped around their home, but inside, the promise made on that desperate night so long ago remained unbroken. She had never frozen again, warmed always by the love of the man who had found her when she was lost and the family they had created together. And in that warmth, Catherine Tucker Garrett knew she had found the truest meaning of home.